Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of our relaunched podcast, That's the Spirit.
I'm Toby Clarke, the editor-in-chief of The Spirit, and I have the privilege of being joined by
Millie Glaister, the executive digital editor of The Spirit. And today we're talking with Adam Habib, director of SOAS and subject of the Fire Habib campaign.
Considering how much is currently going on campus, we could have covered several topics, but considering our time constraints, we chose to focus on the current strike action, security presence on campus, whether Habib can realistically carry on as a leader at SOAS, and his previous time serving at Wits University.
Thank you for taking the time to listen today. We hope you find this discussion interesting, and let's hope that this is the first of many. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Adam.
Pleasure.
We thought we'd open the conversation with just how you think the atmosphere at SOAS is at the moment.
So I think it's mixed. I think on the one hand, over the last 6-7 months, we've received some fairly positive responses around the fact that there's an infrastructural upgrade. There is the upgrade of the entrances, and I think people have received that in a positive way. People have spoken to us about the new lecture rooms that have emerged in the Brunei and the fact that they're appreciative of that. People have been appreciative of the general cleanup and the airiness of the place, and people are appreciative of the fact that they're returning to campus in a real sense after the pandemic and the management of the pandemic. I am worried in more recent days around the strikes and the fact that there is an angst about the strikes. There is an angst about concerns about what it means for people's learning. The fact that people do not want to go back to what was the kind of learning during the pandemic that they were promised to return to face-to-face. The right mix of face-to-face and blended learning is what they're looking at. And we've begun to pick up in the last couple of days some concerns around that. It worries us. We are trying to manage it. We are trying to reflect on it and see how we could do that, given the very difficult circumstances we're in. So, depending on, I think that there's a mix depending on which time frame you're looking at. But more recent days has been a concern around the strikes and its impact on learning.
Okay. You touched on the strikes in your answer. What action is being taken by the SOAS administration to try and resolve these strikes or to come to some sort of agreement to get back to normal learning?
So it depends what we mean. I mean, there are two parts to that question. It seems to be the one is how can we comprehensively resolve the demands of the unions? And the demand of the union is better remuneration. It is worth saying that these negotiations are conducted at a national level. We are part of a national bargaining framework. And that national bargaining framework has tried to negotiate on behalf of 160 institutions, and they've agreed to the last count. It's different at different grades. They offer different offers, but effectively, on average, just over 5% has been offered to workers. That's clearly not been accepted by the unions.
Well, yes.
And that's the challenge that we're in. So my own view on the pension scheme, which is the other part of the strike, I have publicly expressed on behalf of the university that we disagree with the decision to cut the pensions or to reform the pension provisions. And I did so from a different reason. I did so from, you don't make an assessment of the assets of a pension scheme in the middle of a pandemic, which we did in that case. I said this to vice chancellors. I said this to the managers, and I felt that this was inappropriate. I've publicly written about it, saying that I think it's inappropriate. The challenge is that SOAS is one amongst 160 that is a one voice amongst 160. And in the pension, they decided to proceed. It is managed by a board of trustees. And so we don't control that. And so, in a sense, we can't comprehensively resolve the challenge and the demands. There's a second implicit question in that. And that is, what can we do under the circumstances that people are experiencing a strike? And here it is something that we are quite conscious of. You will have noted, I wrote on behalf of the executive wrote a letter to all staff explaining what the finances are, what the challenges are, our concern about student learning, and the fact that we need to be cognizant of that. I've spoken to heads of departments at the senior management team about mitigations and how we put into place mitigations. We put a comprehensive institutional management of that. So Emilia Onyema, who's the Pro-Director of Teaching and Learning, the Interim Pro-Director of Teaching and Learning, is putting together a team with the heads of colleges to manage direct stewardship of what mitigations we can put into place. I cannot promise that there won't be any impact. What I can say is the institution is doing everything it can within the challenges it has to make sure that we deliver as close to what was promised in our perspectives over the term of the actual learning process.
Yeah. So we touched on it briefly there, but the Universities and Colleges Employers Association, the UCEA, SOAS is a member. That's part of the negotiations on the national level. So there are key nominated individuals, if I understand it, from each university that then represents that. So I was wondering if it's you or other people that are these nominated individuals, and whether you have a voice and are able to fight for the workers of this institution within that national conversation.
So when you're talking about workers, you're talking about both academics and professional and services stuff, right?
Yeah.
So firstly, there are two types of representations. The first is UCEA is the national bargaining agency on behalf of employers. And normally there is, on normal matters, they would refer directly to the Human Resources Department, which falls under the COO.
Right.
So that's the day-to-day contact of that.
So that would be Kadir.
That will be really the HR director or
Joe,
and other colleagues in the team. But it would be directly stewarded by Kadir, and they would, under major issues, be discussed with Kadir. On really crucial issues, it would sometimes come to me. And frankly, I am separately in conversations with people in UCI, and particularly the CEO, so Raj, and I have had a number of conversations in this regard. So we are in constant contact at multiple levels around what is possible or not. And we do influence, so they do, for instance, send to us and say, what is the mandate that we give them to start, what is possible, and then they've got to calibrate, if you like, 160 responses and get where they think they reach the collective interest of the 160 institutions. And that's what normally happens. So have I been in conversation with Raj? Yes, I have. I've had one or two conversations with him saying, I am concerned about what is happening. I am concerned about how much room for maneuver we are. Are they being responsive, as responsive in the debates? I did say I think that I would like to see the positions articulated better in the public communication. I think UCU has done a significant job in the communications. I think UK and UCU could do much better in that regard. So I have expressed concerns, but there's also interactions between Joe, the HR team, and the actual actors in the negotiating from UCS.
Absolutely. So you say that SOAS puts forth an initial mandate, and that's then calibrated with the rest of the universities across the country. Do you know, or would you be willing to share with us what the initial
I can say a couple of things. I can say that the initial, when we were there, we gave our initial recommendations based on our finances were lower than 5%.
Right.
And we did say we would accept 5%. And that is based on our this thing. Now, you will see in the communique that we sent to staff, we said to them that if we took a 5% increase in salary on the assumption that the UCR offer is taken up, and it isn't, as you well know, and hasn't been accepted. If we do that, if you bake in our costs, that would mean we would, on our income as of this year's student numbers and research, against the expenditure that we've priced in, because we've spent quite a bit of money over the last 12 months, not simply on infrastructure, but we've spent it on staffing. So, for instance, we are decasualized. We've made a commitment around decasualization. Our casualized staff numbers were about 11.8%. What we call fractionals.
Yeah.
It's down to 6.3%, and that's been an investment. We've put some £2 million into that over the last 18 months. So all of those cost structures have been baked in.
Yeah.
If you take that, our income wouldn't align with our expenditure. And so what we've said to staff members, for us to make an income and expenditure line, we would have to increase our student numbers by between 500 and 600 over the next cycle. So next year we would have to bring in. Now, that's part of our strategic plan. We were supposed to have this 500 and 600. We didn't get it this year because the domestic postgraduate market fell because of the cost of living crisis, collapsed. And so our numbers are lower. I think we can do the 500 and 600, but we would have to get those 5 to 600 if we're going to align our income and expenditure.
Right.
And for me, what was really important about that is if we lose 50% of teaching days, students are not going to be happy.
Right.
And if they're not going to be happy, they will speak to incoming students, and there's a consequence that plays out.
I think there's that's an interesting dynamic that you're sort of putting forward there, because a lot of the people that we've spoken to, in a wider sense and also in preparation for this interview, have stressed their importance for their lecturers being paid as they should be, and meeting the strike demands. And actually, I think there is a lot of student support, and I understand the idea of short-term loss, but I think students are invested in their learning conditions being equal to the teachers' working conditions. So I think it's hard to say that you can't reach those things if strikes are getting in the way, because ultimately strikes will benefit the entire SOAS community if they achieve their aims.
So you make 2 points there. One is the cost structures and whether it's fair, and I'll talk you through that in a minute. The second you make is the students and what the students want. So I'm sure you spoke to students and they've articulated what they've said. The kinds of issues that we receive from students suggest that the opinion is far more diverse. So I'll give you an example. We were party to a WhatsApp group of incoming students, largely from East Asia. And one of the big concerns in that conversation about incoming students is what are the challenges? How do you choose your university? And some of them said, we are concerned about the continuous strikes at SOAS and the instability that comes there. And one of them, and a number of them, said we should look at other universities. Now, I'm not saying they're right or wrong, and I'm not saying they constitute a majority. I am saying the student community, like all communities, is a heterogeneous community. They reflect a plurality of views and a diversity of views. And that's something that one needs to be cognizant of. My own perspective is that, in principle, I think you're right to say that students in general, and I, as a director, do believe that staff need to be paid well. They need to be paid decently. And I am concerned about the fact that conditions of living, salaries in real terms have declined over a 15-year cycle. I've just written a piece publicly saying that the problem with British higher education is the business model is broken. And it is really broken. I think there are two problems with it. Effectively, staff salaries have been, in real terms, declining. We are reliant on student fees. And not only are we reliant on student fees, we are reliant on what I call excessive international fees. So think about it. We just did an assessment of what it costs us to do a PhD student. It costs us about £4,500 per annum. We charge a domestic postgraduate PhD student £4,800. We charge an international student £23,000. That's a 400%, 500% markup. how we don't allow private companies to charge 500% markups. We're doing it as public universities with a social justice mandate. I'm not talking about SOAS, I'm talking about all of that. So I think this is a model that has been broken. I've said it publicly, etc. Having said that, the real question is, how do you navigate that in the kind of climate? The the architecture of higher education is not determined by myself or vice chancellors. It's determined by government itself. Now, if we were simply to give in, let me be blunt. If we were just to do it on the basis of the existing salary, we said we'd be £8 million short. If we're £8 million short and we didn't get the student numbers, if there's £8 million short, we have to find that money somewhere. And there are three things that you can look at. They are your infrastructural investments, there are your IT investments, and there is your salary. Those are our big ticket items. Our IT infrastructure has been underinvested in 15, 20 years. The quality of learning is premised on a decent IT infrastructure. And so we can't cut back on that. There's a large number of people who talk about the importance of decent teaching facilities, our lecture rooms, our frontage. There's a big investment that we're making in the next 12 months on the quality of toilets. I'm astonished at the quality of toilets, and particularly women's toilets in SOAS, and we need them addressed. And that's not simply cleaning. I'm talking about the infrastructural upgrade of the toilets. So these are necessary investments for contingents. I don't want to get into a situation where we are confronted with staff cuts, which is why I take seriously. 2.5 years ago, when we were confronted transformation and change, this community, both its staff and its students, were bruised. I don't want to ever get there, which is why the executive took the collective responsibility to say, here's where we are, and here's what the challenges are. So I've said, and I end here, I've said to colleagues, if we're serious about this, the problem we're doing is, and I've said this to vice chancellors, I've said this to unions, we're fighting amongst ourselves when the people who've created the problem are sitting either in Westminster or in the pension case sitting somewhere in this thing. They're not feeling this pressure. When people strike in SOAS, Rishi Sunak doesn't feel the pressure at all. And frankly, the question is, how do we create a social pact? What in the European case is called a social pact, and in places between Labour and what I would call vice chancellors and executives in higher education, to take the fight where it needs to happen. Because at the moment, we're fighting in the universities, and the people who are paying the cost is effectively students. And I want to kind of think through a strategy. And I've written with David Lunn, Phil Clark, and written publicly in this saying. So I'm really concerned about these issues. But I do think what we've got to think through is how do we take the fight where it needs to, as opposed to fight amongst ourselves. And I frankly think these strikes are not being directed at the architects of the system itself.
It's interesting. There's a couple of points there. First, effectively, what it sounds like to me is that, as it stands, SOAS is an institution that cannot function without the implicit exploitation of its workers. This is, I know you're saying that there's financial constraints, but when you're saying that maths doesn't add up, what we hear as students is that fundamentally this university is built on this exploitation, that we're not respecting the workers, we're not respecting all of these issues, and that's effectively how it has to be, because it has to be like that. You know, it's circular, but having that level of exploitation built into a university is not ideal. And then the second point is that you're saying that these strikes aren't aiming at the right place. Do you not think it's unfair when the workers that have gone on strike, they don't take this decision lightly? It's incredibly difficult. You and the university's management are the people that they're the direct link. You, therefore, are the people that have the power to lobby this change. You're the people that could take the fight to Westminster. You're the people that could, if you did come together and campaign for across the market reform. But do you not think it's unfair to put that on the people that can barely afford to live on their salaries?
So again, two questions. Are universities built on exploitation? My answer is yes. And it's built on an exploitation. This is when I say the business model is broken. Frankly, by the way, I think it's broken even from the perspective of a Tory government, which is a conservative government. Because if they worried about security against China, etc., the whole system was premised on Chinese students being charged lots of money. If the Chinese government closed access, if you take both Indian and Chinese students, that constitutes 45% of international students. If those two governments closed access and refused to allow their students, 75 or 80% of universities in the UK would be bankrupt. So I think this is a business model that is broken. I've said this, and it's exploitative. So I have no denial. The question is the SOAS is an institution that has transformed in many ways. It started as a place that trained colonial administrators. It no longer does that. But is it operating on a political economy that is inclusive and enabling and social democratic in many ways? My answer is no. And that's because of a national system of higher education and a policy architecture in the UK that is significantly problematic in this thing. And that's not going to change within the university system. It has to be changed at multiple levels in broader society. And so this is not a fight that you're going to only do in universities. You have to do it as a collective struggle. Probably find alternative actors to lead the government, get them to commit to a more inclusive agenda, etc., etc., etc. So I think that in some senses, you're right, but what I call a broken business model, what you call the inbuilt exploitation of higher education, I think that broadly that's right. It differs in examples, and frankly, to be honest, even higher education itself has levels of inequality. If you go to Oxford and Cambridge, they have resources and endowments that we don't have, etc. That's the first thing. The second is you said, well, the power lies in the vice chancellors and the directors, and you need to canvass. If we were as powerful as you assume we are, I think we would have succeeded by now. Because actually, when I engage my colleagues in other universities in their capacities as vice chancellors, I was at a dinner last night around research, and one of the most things that struck me was almost all of them said the system is broken. That actually it has to change. We probably have very different views. So I've been arguing that we need to review not only the proportion of fees versus subsidy in favor of subsidy, but I also have been arguing, unlike many of my other colleagues, about the importance of revising international fees, because I think they're grossly unfair and inherently unequal to a point where it's embarrassingly so. And so I think we differ on, but everybody, there isn't a vice chancellor who will say that it's not broken. I don't think we have the capacity you think you are. And I think if you're serious about fundamental change of the policy architecture, I think that is going to require not simply vice chancellors, but if you like, the ability of vice chancellors, union leaders, and other student leaders to act as a comprehensive collective community. But at the moment, that doesn't exist.
I appreciate that. It's interesting. I think the trouble is with saying that all of these vice chancellors, they agree with that. What would you say the median salary in that room was last night? Because I think what's hard is that we look at these statistics, we have these figures. I believe your salary is over 300,000. It's hard to feel like we're in a fight together when it doesn't feel like the people at the top are taking any of the heat.
So Are salaries in the UK, are Vice Chancellor's salaries higher? The answer is absolutely. Vice Chancellor's salaries in many systems are higher. Is the difference between Vice Chancellor's salaries and the lowest paid worker? What is the difference? It's worth saying that SOAS is the lowest in the system, by the way. So the differential between the lowest salary and the highest salary being me, is the lowest in the system. That's the first. The second, it is worth saying that yes, my salary is significantly higher than most other staff members. It is also saying that it's significantly lower than most other vice chancellors. That doesn't justify it, if you like, but you've got to think through collectively where vice chancellors are paid, what is an appropriate differential given their responsibilities, etc., and structure that in a particular way. Different systems do so differently. I will say this, when I came in, I was asked by the board not to negotiate a salary and to take what exactly was the previous salary. And that's what I did agree to, partly because when I left Wits, that board said to me that SOAS was in a difficult position. I agreed to that. So I have not in any way have anything different to what they offered me. And ironically, I didn't even negotiate on it. Now, I put all of these things out not to defend myself, but you asked a question and I wanted to give you the context for it. The point you asking is I don't want to suggest that the vice chancellors are in the same boat as workers by any means. I do want to say that if you're seriously committed to systemic change of the higher architecture, I'm saying to you that where I come from, there was a wonderful saying by Nelson Mandela. If you want to succeed in winning fundamental change, you divide the enemy, you unite your forces. The trick, if you want to win the structure and reform of higher education, the trick about this is to try and build a collective community that speaks with one voice. At the moment, I don't think you get that in higher education. I don't think you get that amongst vice chancellors. I don't think you get that amongst the collective community. And I think what you're doing and what you're saying is fights that are happening within the logic of the university in which students are getting hurt. My responsibility as director, I cannot resolve the financial crisis. It's outside the executive's control. But it is our responsibility to mitigate the consequences for student learning. And we are trying to do that as well as we can. That's the responsible act, it seems to me. But we are acting within the framework of what is possible. The world is what it is. It's our desire is to change it. But we have to operate within the realities of what we have. I don't want to make, and the executive doesn't want to make decisions, that today we make a decision and in 5 months we have to make choices that hurt people in a different way. And so we think with the long term. Sorry, I didn't.
No problem. Moving on to a separate but still connected issue. Lots of students and particularly our readers have found it hard to reconcile the idea of you being a good faith actor at SOAS with certain controversial comments that were made towards the start of your tenure. Can you just reflect on those comments and whether your position is truly sustainable, given that lots of students have lost faith in you as a leader here at SOAS?
So, look, my position is very simply that I apologize because, and I said it, I apologize because people felt hurt.
Right.
And I've articulated an apology in that regard. I stand by that. No malevolence was intended. That was deliberated upon, reflected upon by a board, and they asked me to continue.
Right.
Since I was 18, been an anti-racist activist. I've spent time in prison, in an apartheid prison. For the first half of my life, I fought as an activist to break a system. For the second half of my life, I fought to build inclusive institutions. If you want to look at my credentials as an anti-racist, both in that earlier period and in the second period, it's evident by the fact that when you go to a place like Johannesburg, where every public institution is on the verge of collapse, Wits University is financially sustainable, it's academically fantastic, its research output is up, it's now got a majority of black staff, it's now got a majority at its black students are more than 80% in every single indicator. That has completely transformed in a way that I am comfortable with and that I think speaks to social justice agendas.
So,
On SOAS, in the last 2 years, we've just made a series of appointments in all of those indicators, from finances to the number of black professors that have been appointed, to the number of inclusion agendas that have happened. We've done incredibly well. My view is I've apologized, I stand by that, but no malevolence was intended. This decision has been made. I'm moving on to focus on what is the job at hand.
right. So let's look at your credentials. Obviously, you speak a lot about your anti-racism, your work for social justice. How does that conform with what we're seeing, your history at Wits, you called the police onto campus to shut down protests about fees. You then came to SOAS. In the first general meeting, you used a racial slur. You've apologised in the sense that you've said that you're sorry that people felt hurt, which I do want to acknowledge is different than apologising for using the word. And I do think our community knows that. And then in your tenure here, you've increased securitisation on campus. People don't feel safe. Even this week, there was police on campus and a student was arrested. Generally, when we speak to students, securitisation is one of their biggest issues. And considering your history at Wits, you'd understand why people don't have faith in you to be the one to lead SOAS. I think when we're talking about credentials, it's important to look at all those things, because it's great that you've done all this stuff, but you also can't take away from the fact that there are very real negative impacts to your actions as well.
So let's start again with those things. And I'm glad you asked the question. You see, I did bring police in SOAS. One of the fundamental lessons about decolonization is to understand context. That executive that made that decision in Wits to call in police didn't do it to shut down protests. It did it to actually stop 17 attempts at blowing up a building. Now, you might not see that, but there's quite accurate evidence for that. When there was a vote of Wits students on whether to open up the campus, 79% voted in favor of opening up that campus. So it's very easy for people to sit in London and make easy judgments about an institution that is very far away in a completely different context. The only thing I ask people to do is think about the different context and the difficult choices that have to be made in that context. And don't make easy judgments about it. I went back to Wits 7 weeks ago because they have a tradition where they put up the photograph of a vice chancellor in the Senate Hall. That's what they did. That's not somebody. I have a far more positive relationship with staff, with students, with even some of the leadership figures. So easy judgments are made by people who don't need and understand the very, very specific circumstances of of Wits itself. On the issue of SOAS, we are committed to this place being a place for free speech, for free activity. What we are not committed to doing is allowing the learning and teaching to be irreparably damaged. And so when security staff are here, that's not securitization, by the way. People have very little understanding of securitization. Securitization is when the police are on place, when militaries come onto campuses. What we've put in place is security mechanisms to keep the community safe. And you say, and I respect the fact that you've spoken to people that say that they are concerned about this. I've got people who said thank you for enabling an environment in which we can continue to learn, in which we can continue to teach. So I just want to say to you, it's very difficult to manage a set of circumstances where, in this context of where, for instance, if you take SOAS, where people are, some people want to strike, or other students want to support the strike, yet others want to come and learn. We have to manage, as an executive, the competing interests of a diverse school community. That's what our agenda is. And we try to create the collective consensus that is there. We try to act in the institutional interest as opposed to the interests of one or other small group of community. So I think that that's worth saying, and that's important. These are difficult choices in all of these contexts, and we've got to manage those difficult choices. That's what we try to do. And none of those decisions are Adam Habib's, by the way. Those decisions are collective executive. This institution doesn't run by Adam Habib. It runs by an executive team. And that is something. It's not Adam Habib making these decisions. It's a collective executive making those decisions that is accountable to a board. And all of these decisions have been reported to the board. And there's an assurance of that board. And that's also worth bearing in mind.
Okay. You spoke about the importance of...
This has to be the final question.
Of course, yeah, no worries. You spoke about the importance of free speech on campus. Last November, a student attended a book launch and he raised questions about your time at Wits. And then he was subsequently dragged out by his collar by security. He was doing nothing but exercising his right to free speech. So how do you reconcile being a kind of free speech evangelist and the way in which he was treated by security?
If you look at the history of progressive discourse on free speech, we allow for free speech, but you also are allowed for free speech so that it doesn't affect the rights of others. So let me give you an example. The most classic liberal text says you can say free speech, but it also says that you can't walk into a crowded cinema and say there's a fire on the basis of your free speech and create some people trying to rush out and get hurt. So there's always, all rights are accompanied by social accountability. Now, in that context, and let me come back. You've asked me a question. In that context, this person came to an alumni event. There was an alumni event speaking about a particular book on Chinese. It was a Chinese literature. The person stands up and has nothing to do with the topic at hand, deliberately puts something completely separate on the table. Now, there was security moved in. I wasn't there. They very politely asked the person to leave. I wasn't there. They removed the person without violence, without, as you say, by the scruff of their collar, and remove them from that circumstance. Rights come with responsibilities. When you, not you as an individual, but when an individual demands respect, when the individual demands rights, it also comes with responsibilities. You can't say, I want rights, but I don't take the responsibilities of living in an institutional community where other people have rights, and their rights need to be as respected as your rights are. It's about the collective interests that we bring together. And that's the fundamental thing. Now,
we know that you're conscious of time, but we just want to push back on that slightly.
I'm sure
we'll make one final remark. I think that you've used a completely false analogy there. This is not social accountability. In that situation, they were asking the student was asking the author about her position in relation to your history when the content of her work has been concerning holding these, being against this type of thing. So I do think that there was relevance there. They were given the mic by the ambassadors, and it was therefore that is exactly the type of security that we are concerned about, and I appreciate that you have things to say about that, but I think that's a fundamental disagreement.
That is a fundamental disagreement, but as I said, in my view, rights come with responsibilities, and there were on average another 100 people there, and 99 of them came to listen to a world-renowned author on her Chinese, on the book that she put forward and the stories that it said. That's what they came.
And they didn't want to listen to her answer to that question?
Their rights were respected. And by the way, she was asked the question. She declined to answer it. Nobody stopped her. So my question is, as much as you are speaking about rights, remember everybody else in the institutional community has rights. And your performance of your rights is important, but so is everybody else's rights, and you need to balance that. It's our responsibility as the executive, I say again, not as Adam, as the executive, to manage the competing interests. And that's something that I do say. I wrote, one of the fundamental principles of all rights, including the right to free speech, is they're always accompanied by the principle of social accountability. The accountability of the performance of your rights within the framework of the broader institutional community, which you owe a commitment to, and which everyone as citizens of this community owe a commitment to. So when we demand our rights, we make sure that we're respectful of everybody else's rights. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Adam, for talking to us. Thank you again for listening. And please be sure to check out our social media to stay up to date on everything spirit related.